Hey guys, welcome to my drawing tutorial on capturing likeness in a portrait. And for this one, I decided to go with Michael Phelps to use as my example, because in my opinion, he's got a very distinct face with a lot of features that are easy to capture. So first what I'm going to do here is I'm going to sort of sketch over the photo so I can show you guys, how I usually start. So first what I want to do is I want to pay attention to the overall shape of his head. And now if you're just a beginner and you don't have a lot of experience drawing faces, a good strategy to start with is to draw a circle. And then you want to get the center line in there. That's actually the most important part. So that way you can get the symmetry down from the left side to the right side. And now the eye line should fall right, if you look at the circle, the eye line should fall right towards the bottom. In this example, his head is slightly tilted, so you want to pay close attention to the eye line and the center line. You want to make sure those are also slightly tilted as well. And now you pay attention to the shape of his jaw and the bottom of his chin. His chin's very wide, as you can see here. And a good thing I like to do is, once I've drawn in the center line and the top of his head, I like to draw in the bottom of the chin and then connect his jawline from where the eye line is all the way down to where the bottom of the chin is. And this little line here represents the halfway point between the eye line and the bottom of his chin. However, in this example here, we see that his nose actually falls just above the center line. And again, the reason why I'm showing you guys this step here is so that you can get an idea of how I think and how I break down the face into simple shapes and forms when I'm actually going in to sketch out the portrait. And now, if you notice, the sides of his mouth extend a little bit beyond the edge of the nostrils. And actually, his upper lip, the top of it is actually completely flat, if you pay close attention. And then the lower half of his upper lip sort of dips down. And then for the placement of the eyes, a good strategy to use is you can draw a triangle starting from the tip of the nose and coming up to not exactly where the eye line meets the bottom of the circle, but about, I'd say, a little less than half an inch away from there. That's where you want the triangle to go. And now this is going to determine where the edge of the eyeball is. And also you can draw a line from the edge of the nostril straight up. Basically that's where his eyes are going to be placed. So right about here. And then for the placement of his ears, here it looks like, well, his head is tilting down slightly. If we were looking at his face straight on, the tops of his ears would be pretty much in line with the top of his eyebrows. But here, since he's looking down slightly, the ear line is going to be a little bit above the top of his eyebrows. And then same thing with the bottom. If we were looking at it from straight ahead, the bottoms of the ears would align with the bottom of the nose. But as the top of his ears are a little bit slanted upward, as his face is turning down, the bottom of his ears are going to be just above where the bottom of the nose is. Now, another thing to pay attention to is his forehead. If we just block out the basic shape from the bottom of his hairline to his eyebrows, we see that it's basically just a rectangle. His forehead's not too big, and like I said, his hairline comes down pretty low. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to the actual sketch. Okay, so we're going to create a new layer here in the Layers panel, and we're just going to call this one Sketch. And then we're going to go to the color palette and just pick out a light shade of turquoise blue. If you want, you can do a lighter shade of gray. Me personally, I just like to use light shades of blue because it's just easy to trace over. Make sure we clear. Alright, and now we're going to start with the overall shape of his head. And like I mentioned, we want to keep in mind that his head is on a bit of a slant, so in this case, it's actually better to start with the center line so that we can establish the angle that the head is facing in. So about right. Now we're just going to put in the top of his head. And then as we get down towards the bottom of his chin, right at the bottom of the center line, we want to just draw in a horizontal line where his chin would be. And then we're going to connect the top of his cheekbone to the bottom of the chin. Alright, and now let's draw the eye line. And remember, a good way to measure this is by just drawing in a circle inside the shape. And you want to make sure the eye line is more towards the bottom of the circle. And then you want to go from the eye line down and pay attention to that whole form. And then the halfway point of that is about here, so that means the nose is going to be a little bit above. Or actually, wait. The halfway point is, looks like it's right about here. So the nose is going to be just slightly above that point. The nose is going to go, and then let's draw a line for his mouth. And then we're just going to rough in his eye sockets as well. Roughing in the eye sockets, in this step, it'll help you define where the eyebrows are going to be placed as well as the eyes themselves. And also another thing is you want to pay attention to the space between his eye and then his cheekbone. It's going to be about, it's like a little less than an inch on both sides. We're going to go back to the sketch, and looks like I might need to extend his cheekbones out a little bit more to create that space that's needed. So let's do that. And of course, in this rough step, you can, adjust or tweak things accordingly. And this is actually the best time to do so because you don't want to move on to cleaning up the line work or the inking or even the coloring, and then you realize, oh wait, I made a mistake back there. then that's going to make it harder because then you're going to have to backtrack and basically undo everything you did. So this is the part where you want to make sure everything looks correct before you move on to those steps. Okay, let's do his hairline. Again, his forehead is basically a rectangle. Not a very big forehead, so you want to make sure the hairline comes down pretty far. And then just looking back at the photograph, the sides of his head sort of point outward, like so. And then you got the top of his head. It's like up here is the highest point. So go back to the sketch. And then let's have his hairline extend out a little bit. And then let's find that high point right there and just connect the lines. Alright, now let's add his ears in. And remember, from the photograph, we established that he's looking down slightly. So the tops of his ears are going to be just slightly above the top of his eyebrows. And as well as the bottom of his ear is going to be just slightly above the bottom point of the nose. Alright, that looks pretty good. Let's bring his hairline up a little more. Alright, now we can roughen his eyes by using the triangle strategy that I explained before. But first we should draw in the nostrils. And if we look back at the photograph here, his nostrils come out pretty wide. And now what I like to do when drawing noses is I like to establish the tip of the nose, or the furthest point. I usually like to define that by drawing a circle. And then if we notice here, his nostrils come out pretty far. So we're going to go back to the sketch and draw them, and just rough those in real quick. And now the placement of his eyes, where his tear ducts are, right here, that falls just above, well, it's not as far out as his nostril is. It's a little bit inward. So on both sides of his face, that's where his tear ducts are going to be placed. And then of course, the other side of his eyeball is going to be right about there. We're going to use the triangle strategy again. Go back to the sketch. And now when I draw eyes, I like to just rough in a circle first to represent where the eyeball is going to go. And the reason I do this is because in a little bit here, when I move on to cleaning up the lines a little bit, I just like to use it as sort of a base, or like guidelines, kind of like, this entire sketch here, just forming in the rough shapes to be used as an underlayer to draw from. And I like to just draw in the circles so that way when I'm actually drawing the eyelids in, I can sort of imagine them wrapping around, because obviously the eyeball's are round, of course. And just using that as a guide allows me to sort of lock in where the upper and lower eyelids are going to be placed. Let's do his eyebrows real quick. Here they're actually pretty thick. Not too thick, but they're not like strings either. Just blocking in so I can see exactly how thick they're going to be. So let's go back over here and just lock in where that's going. Let's go back down to his mouth. And remember what I said before, the top of his upper lip is actually nearly flat. And then the bottom is a little bit, it's going to dip in slightly. And we'll just block in where his teeth are going to go, right here. Just throw in his lower lip. It looks like I might need to extend his chin down a little bit and round it off at the bottom. So I can just erase and adjust. And we'll just bring that down a little bit. Like I mentioned, this is the stage where you want to, like, it's okay to be messy and rough with the sketch. Like, obviously this is no clean piece of line work here, but that's okay because this is the part where you want to establish the placement, proportions, how everything's going to look before you move on. And this is something I used to have difficulty with, where I'd move on to the line work way too soon, and then I'd realize, oh wait, this actually doesn't look right because I didn't notice it before. So it's just a good skill to practice, just really knowing where everything goes first and being happy enough with it, you know, before you move on to the next step. All right, and if we look back at the photograph over here, he's got some dimples over here on the sides of his face. So that's another thing you want to include. Because when you're capturing the look of a face in a sketch, it's good to be as detail-oriented as possible and really make sure you get every little feature in there. And then we'll just draw in his neck. He's got a pretty wide neck, as you can see here. The edge isn't touching where his jawline meets the ear directly. It's a little bit outwards, and right about there. You want to keep that in mind. But then on the right side, you know, it's pretty much right in line with the part of the jaw that meets his lower ear. Alright, let's just make sure everything is placed correctly. So far, so good. Alright, now we can take this layer, the sketch layer, and let's bring the opacity down to 30%. Or, yeah, 30% should work. You want it to be light enough where you can trace over it, but obviously you don't want it to be too light, like 2%, you can barely see that. Even 10% is pretty hard to pick out, so let's do 32. We're going to lock this layer, and then we're going to create a new layer above that and call it lines. So let's go and grab the color black from the color palette. And what I like to do with faces is I like to start by drawing the eyes in first, because, I don't know, for me at least, it's just a good starting point to go off of. It's just a good way to establish the rest of the face. Alright, so first what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the two eyeballs that I roughed in before. Just basically two circles. And first thing I want to do is establish where the tear ducts are going to go. So see, you can still see the guideline underneath that I drew in before. So the tear duct is going to be placed just above the nostril. And then the other side of the eye is going to be placed right here where the diagonal line that we drew in for the triangle, the other side of the eye is going to be right where that line meets the initial horizontal eye line that we drew in before. And I just like to draw a little dot there to define where that's going to be. And now, the bottom of his lower eyelid, it should, wrap around where the bottom of that circle was placed. As I mentioned, it's just a good way to sort of know how the eyelids wrap around the eye and how they're placed. And then in a second here, once I draw the other eye, then I'll go in and add the pupils. And another thing to keep in mind too, if we notice around his eyes, right around his eyeballs and his eyelids, there's some, subtle little wrinkles. That's what I said before about having an eye for detail. You want to make sure that you remember to, include the little things. And now let's just draw in his pupils real quick. And now the way I like to draw eyes, especially in this case, Michael Phelps got dark brown eyes. I usually just like to fill in the entire circle and then go and grab my eraser tool. And I just like to erase little bits, to represent where there's light reflecting off of his eyes. All right, next thing we can do is the eyebrows. All right, and remember, he's got thicker eyebrows, but you don't want to make them too thick either, or too thin. And now, as I'm drawing this, I actually have the same photograph up on my computer screen, just so I can reference it here and there as I need to. Otherwise I'm basically flying blind, which isn't a good thing, because you could miss something. So you want to make sure if you're drawing from any reference, whether it's a face or the human figure, doesn't matter. You always want to make sure you have that reference open just in case. Alright, there we go. Now we're going to move down to his nose and just block in the nostrils that we defined before. Now moving down to his mouth. And now remember, the top of that upper lip is going to be nearly flat, and then it's the bottom part of his upper lip that's going to dip down. And now I like to, when I draw teeth, I basically just Like, I don't draw each individual tooth. I just block in the entire thing, and then what I do is just draw little lines to show some of the teeth. You don't have to draw every single one, but like especially around the edges over here, you know, it's good to sometimes just define where the teeth are. And then we'll just draw the top of his chin. I usually like to do this by just either drawing one or several, you know, curved lines right there. And we can just block in the bottom of his chin. And let's not forget about those dimples over here. Alright, now we can move to his cheekbones. Up top. And also keep in mind the space that we established before between the edge of his eye and the side of his cheekbone. It's going to be about an inch, maybe a little bit less, so definitely keep that in mind and make sure that there's enough space. And now from here we can simply connect the cheekbone to the bottom of the chin with the jawline, so let's go ahead and do that. And now, when you're drawing a face from the front view like this, on both sides you want to make sure the curve in the jaw is at the same exact point. So over here, the curve is right about at that point, so let's draw a line straight across. Just a little guide so we know where it's going to be placed on the other side, so it's going to be about right there. And this is just a good way to make sure the symmetry is looking right. Because obviously that would look pretty weird if the curve in his jaw was higher on one side than it was on the other, or if it was lower. So just a good strategy to use. Alright, why don't we move to his hairline next. Actually, let me just establish where his forehead is. Alright, let's go to his hair. And now if we look back at the photograph, it looks like he's got pretty defined sideburns right here, so we want to make sure we include those as well. Alright, and then with his hair, since this is like a stylized portrait, and we're not going for super photorealism here, what we can do is, we don't have to define and draw in every little individual hair. Because let's be honest, that would take a real long time, and it just wouldn't really match the style too well that I'm going for. What we're going to do is define the point where the hair is flowing from. That's going to be right about here. And then we're just going to define the hair flow by just sketching in some light, smooth flowing lines, all coming from that one source. Now, when I draw ears, I've established a little technique to use, and basically, no matter if I'm creating a face from scratch or if I'm drawing directly from a photograph, I pretty much draw up my ears the exact same way each time. You know, unless I'm drawing a particular face where the ears are one of the defining qualities, and in that case, you want to, you know, adhere to the photo and draw it as accurately to the picture as possible. But in a lot of cases, the ears are usually not one of the defining qualities of someone's face. So I've established a little way to draw my ears. Basically, I start with a little W shape that's tilted on its side, and then I throw in 2 little curved lines, like so. And that's basically it. Pretty straightforward and simple. And now, another thing to keep in mind is Phelps has a little bit of facial hair here. He's got like the little 5 o'clock shadow thing going on. So, one thing I like to do, actually, before I move on, I'm actually going to widen his chin a little bit more. Notice it's a little too thin. Now, with his facial hair, you don't have to draw in every little piece of hair, kind of like the top of his head. What I like to do now is I'm going to create another layer underneath my lines, and I'm just going to grab a really light shade of gray and a bigger brush tool, and I'm basically just going to fill in, still a little dark, it's a little lighter. I'm basically just going to fill in the areas where his facial hair would be. And then what you can also do is, after you've done that, you can go back to the lines layer, and you can just grab a really, really thin brush. Like let's do 6 point for the tip size. And what you can do is you can just sort of draw in some of the little individual hairs. You don't have to do all of it because, like I said, it's a stylized portrait, so, things are going to be a little bit more simplified than if it was actually like a photorealistic portrait. And, it just is a good way to show that you got a good eye for detail. Alright, now going back up to the eyebrows, I noticed they're a little bit wide, especially his left eyebrow, so I'm actually just going to erase a little bit of that. And same thing on the left side. I'm sorry, I meant to say on the left side here, it was coming out a little too far, so I'm just going to erase some, and then do the same thing on the right side. And now what you can do here to show, like especially on the sides of his eyebrows, if you want to show that, there's some little gaps where, there's less of the hair, you can just take a thin eraser tool and just go in and erase a tiny bit around the edges, to show those little gaps. Okay, and then since he's got darker hair, just to show that here, I'm actually just going to go back to the layer that we laid in the 5 o'clock shadow, and just grab a slightly darker shade of gray, and we're just going to fill in the top of his head so that it's, obvious that he's got darker brown hair. If I'm ever drawing a character or a portrait and the person has blonde hair, I'll usually show that. If it's a black and white sketch, I'll show that by leaving the hair white or not filled in at all. And now, obviously, like if you're going for a more stylized look, such as this, it doesn't have to look exactly 100% like the reference photo. As long as you capture the main features, such as the shape of his mouth, or his bushy eyebrows, or the size of his chin, or his elongated jawline, as long as you've got the basic features and that they're clearly defined, then it should be pretty easy to make out who the person is that you're drawing. because if you've done a good job at capturing the likeness, people should take a look, and without even reading the caption or anything, they should be able to instantly tell that, oh hey, that's Michael Phelps. Alright, so there we have it. There's the finished Michael Phelps portrait. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I definitely enjoyed putting it together for you. And if you've got any other questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section below. And at some point I may do another tutorial using this sketch on the inking process and maybe even the coloring. So those are definite possibilities for the near future. Alrighty guys, thanks again for watching. I really appreciate all your support. And as always, keep persevering. Thanks again.